Hello, I'm Chuck Easley, and the title of this paper is Institutional Flexibility and Entrepreneurship, Evidence from China. There's a theoretical puzzle in the literature around institutional theory and entrepreneurship. Institutional theory, for its part, has tended to be characterized by its emphasis on the stability, rigidity of institutions, taken for granted assumptions, and how certain behaviors and ways of thinking become institutionalized. This has caused it to struggle with addressing questions around entrepreneurship, which typically revolve around emergence, questioning assumptions, and behaviors more like divergent thinking and creativity. So the question I'm going to ask in this paper is might we design institutions to enhance individual entrepreneurial behavior? There's one strand of institutional theory that has addressed questions around embedded agency and how individuals might break free from institutional structures and act more independently. This has been the literature on institutional entrepreneurs. This literature focuses on how individuals might strive to change the institutional structure and how they might start to access routines and behaviors aimed at consciously striving to alter institutions. And so, while they've been termed institutional entrepreneurs, there's not much entrepreneurship going on here in the sense of creating new organizations or commercializing new technologies. And most of this literature also looks at the current institutional environment rather than the institutional environment that an individual was trained in or occurred in their past. So different from the previous literature, I'm going to look at reform in institutions that happen during an individual's university training, and then look at how that influences their subsequent entrepreneurial behavior. So I'm going to control for the current institutional environment, but the question is going to be around whether an individual graduated before this university level reform or afterwards. And we're going to compare similar individuals before and after the reform to see if subsequently in their careers there's a difference in their entrepreneurial behavior. So I'm going to introduce a new concept, which I call institutional flexibility, which is the characteristic of environments that permits and legitimizes individual choice itself. So rather than legitimizing a particular choice or particular behavior, as most institutional theorists have written about, I'm going to think about legitimizing the act of individual choice itself. And so, just to fix ideas a bit, the particular context that I have in mind here is course credit reform at Tsinghua University. And so before 1984, Tsinghua operated on the academic year system. This had a very rigid teaching schedule. The university basically arranged what courses were taken by students, and so students couldn't really select courses according to their interests or change their majors or things like this. After 1984, the university switched over to the course credit system. So we're very familiar with this in the West, as these changes happened much earlier in Western universities. Relaxed restrictions on courses, students could change majors. Basically, students could select courses according to their interests. There are also a lot more elective courses offered by departments. And so with this reform, choice itself was institutionalized. There was no particular major or particular course that students had to take. As long as as long as students meet the number of credits required, then they get much greater flexibility and freedom in what courses they can choose. So basically, the credit system allows students more flexibility to select courses, and so we're going to look at the outcomes on entrepreneurial intentions, as well as on actual founding behavior. So in contrast, a less flexible system would tend to endow students with a single way of thinking about the world, a single set of assumptions and impressions about what kinds of careers are valuable. With more flexibility, my argument is that students are more likely to encounter a novel entrepreneurial idea. So this is because they can better take classes across departments, which enables them to question previously taken for granted assumptions that tend to get built into a single disciplinary framework. So this allows them to see problems from new perspectives, recombine ideas across divergent fields, and question traditional disciplinary frameworks. So the first hypothesis is that there will be a positive relationship between institutional change to a more flexible system and a university alumni's subsequent entrepreneurial intentions. Second hypothesis is not only will they be more likely to come across an entrepreneurial idea and have intentions of being an entrepreneur, but they'll also be more likely to pursue entrepreneurship. This is because a more flexible institutional environment helps students to develop a mindset geared towards pursuing opportunities and their own interests. Students are forced to get practice in undertaking some career planning and choosing courses. Improves the students' independent decision-making capabilities. In addition, the greater variety of coursework that they can take can also result in a greater mix of skills, which previous work has shown increases the probability of entrepreneurial activity. So the second hypothesis is that you'll see greater entrepreneurial activity amongst alumni who graduated under a more flexible system. So next I want to look at who in particular is going to be more affected by these reforms, by this type of reform to a more flexible system. So because a more flexible system gives students the opportunity to pursue their interests and to pursue interests that are at the intersection of fields, we should see a greater impact on those who do not fit well into the traditional academic environment. And so within this particular context, the appropriate measure, the appropriate metric of how well students fit in with the academic environment is their GPA. This is what measures whether they exhibit the behaviors that are expected by the institution. And so because lower GPA students may be spending relatively less time and effort on their academic coursework, they may have interests outside of the classroom, a more flexible system is going to give them greater freedom to pursue those interests. And so these are the lower GPA students are the ones that we expect to be more influenced by this type of reform. The empirical context for this study comes from an alumni survey of Tsinghua University that I did in collaboration with the Alumni Association. We mailed and also emailed surveys out to all 27,000 alumni of the university across graduation years and across schools. We received about 11% response rate, and the real advantage of this data set is that it gives us a very well-defined set of individuals who are at risk of potentially becoming entrepreneurs. This is the first such alumni survey that's been done abroad, and it gives us very detailed work history and founding data that's less biased by concerns of government collection relative to existing surveys. This is some characteristics of the overall Tsinghua alumni population that we got from the Alumni Association and the university, and they match up very well with the Tsinghua survey sample, increasing our confidence that the survey is representative of Tsinghua alumni. We're going to use a self-reported GPA measure, and so as you might expect, we had fewer people reporting that they were in the lowest quartile, but it's not as bad as you might expect. These are the characteristics of the Tsinghua alumni survey respondents relative to some nationally representative surveys in China. And so you see that, as you would expect, the Tsinghua alumni are much more highly educated. than the average Chinese citizen, more likely to be male, and slightly less likely to have experienced a layoff. But otherwise, in terms of their family characteristics, family background, very similar to the broader population of Chinese citizens. These are the locations of the entrepreneurial respondents. There's a large cluster in Beijing, also a large cluster in Shanghai. And in addition to launching a survey, I've done about 42 interviews with entrepreneurs and investors and university officials to better understand the context. These are some descriptive statistics of the percentage of entrepreneurs by their graduation decade. And so we see big increases in the 1980s and 1990s. So because we want to control for the fact that the entrepreneurial environment overall has been improving over the years in China, to better isolate the effects of graduating before versus after the reform, and we're going to use a control for the entrepreneurial environment, and we've chosen the ratio of the private economy to the public economy. So basically, the percentage of the economy that is private relative to state-owned. And so this ratio has been going up, obviously, as the entrepreneurial environment improves. But the ratio has also stayed fairly steady since 1998. And so we're going to restrict our entrepreneurial events to 1998 and afterwards in order to have a better control for these changes in the overall environment. So our first set of regression results looks at entrepreneurial intentions. So these are all measured as of 2007. So there's no variation in the current environment that's going on here, because this is entrepreneurial intentions as of the time of the survey. So you wouldn't expect to see any differences according to graduation year normally. We've, as you can see, very carefully controlled here for the effects of age, as well as for a number of other educational, work history, and family background characteristics of these individuals. So we control for how broad of a major they were in, we control for the level of education, family economic status, career history, number of different job positions, whether they went overseas, whether they majored in a newer major. And still, we continue to find a significant and positive effect of the credit system reform. So students who graduated after the change to a more flexible credit system were significantly more likely to have entrepreneurial intentions. And so you might be concerned, as we were, that this is due to some differences between the very most recent graduates and people who graduated long before the reform. So we narrow down the sample to look more specifically at those who graduated just before versus just after the reform. And we continue to find significant positive effects of the credit system reform on entrepreneurial intentions. So similarly, we look at actually founding a business using a hazard rate model. So these are Cox hazard rate models, basically the same specification, and we find not only positive and significant effects here for the credit system reform, but in support of our third hypothesis, we find a negative and significant coefficient on the interaction between the credit system reform and GPA, indicating that it was those lower GPA students who were more likely to be influenced by the credit reform. So overall, we find that when you just look at GPA, the lower GPA students are more likely to found firms. But when you then look at the interaction between credit system reform and GPA, we find that before the credit reform, the higher GPA students were more likely to found firms. And after the credit system reform, the lower GPA students become significantly more likely than they have in the past to found firms. And this is the time trend of these results. And as expected, the low GPA students significantly increase their likelihood of founding after the credit system reform. So one possible alternative story is perhaps the student composition has changed after the reform. And so we don't find much evidence of this. We look at students who had entrepreneurial parents, siblings, close relatives, friends, or neighbors, and find that, if anything, those who are gaining admittance to Tsinghua University are from less entrepreneurial backgrounds overall. So we don't think that this is a plausible alternative explanation. So in conclusion, we have theoretical contributions to both the institutional theory literature and the entrepreneurship literature. Implications for institutional theory are, historically, there's been a focus on the durable impact of institutions. And so here we contribute by focusing on the institutionalization of choice itself rather than a particular choice. And also, rather than looking at institutional change, focusing on the properties of institutions. So, more flexible institution as a characteristic of the type of institution. We also contribute by theorizing that it's not just the current institutional environment that matters, but also the past institutional environment in which an individual received university training can also have an impact. We introduced this concept of institutional flexibility, which is related to some other concepts in the literature. Proto-institutions, these are institutions that are in development, or fluid or changing institutions, people have written about before. Here, we're really looking at an actual fully formed institution. This is also related to the idea of institutional complexity, which is the idea that there sometimes multiple institutional forces are acting on individuals or companies at the same time, which might give them more choice about which institution to follow. But people hadn't really looked at this specific issue or this specific concept before. So we also contribute by looking at which particular individuals are affected, and provide a bit more of a middle ground between the entrepreneurship literature, which sees entrepreneurs as heroic individuals, and the institutional theory literature, which sees individuals as cultural dopes, just kind of following on the winds of institutional change. And so, like the recent literature on embedded agency, we provide more of a middle ground. There are also implications for the academic entrepreneurship literature, most of which is focused on faculty spin-offs and technology transfer policies. But we point out here that university training has an important role in entrepreneurship, and that the students and alumni ventures themselves are influenced by the experiences of the students while at the university. So while previous literature had found no impact of the level of education on entrepreneurship, few before this paper had looked at the link between the content of education and entrepreneurship. So I think there's a lot of really exciting future work that could be done with this concept of institutional flexibility, both at the firm level in terms of strategy, and also with employment policies like flex time at Google, for instance. And it could be quite interesting to look at the role of institutional flexibility on industry evolution, eras of ferment, or the idea that perhaps firms that are born in this kind of environment might have reason to be more innovative or more disruptive. So thank you very much. This was my paper on institutional flexibility and entrepreneurship.